No, it's such a pleasure to be here with you for this wonderful conference. And it's a massive commendation to the team at the Pain Society of Alberta for the tireless work you've done in putting together this event, and also for the commitment and the care that you have and the support for people in pain. So it's such an honor for me to be here. So I chose this word titration here, specifically because, it's a specialized and a technical word related to dosage and to effect. But it also has some art within it when we put it into practice. So in pure chemistry, for instance, when we titrate something, we base it on firm time and numbers. But when we apply an idea of titration to something like medication, we also bring an element of feeling and an individual response to that medication. How someone responds, how they might feel, and how their biomarkers might change determines decision making, what we might do next with that medication. So in this talk, what I want to propose is the way that we talk and listen and communicate and educate in the clinic around the problems of pain, and also the way that we bring in psychologically informed methods of practice possibly has this similar dose relationship response. So, and I think that to develop and be able to deliver that kind of care, we have an additional skill set and cognitive capacity that's rare, that we need to develop, that's rarely taught within healthcare and medical education. And thank you for that introduction, Christelle. As Christelle said, I come to narrative medicine as a physiotherapist, and I specialize working with people in pain. And I recognize that not everyone that will be here today also, comes from that world. I hope everything that I can present here today, fits across the multidisciplinary, the interdisciplinary perspectives that we have here together. So I wanted to start with a big idea. I find it frustrating, to have to get to the end of a presentation to pull everything together. So I sort of wanted to give you the context up front. If you work with people, if those people have stories about their life experiences, if you'd like them to tell that story, perhaps you have information that you want to share with people, you think that might be useful to help them alter their cognitions or their behaviors, then there's certain and specific skill sets you need that in narrative medicine we call narrative competence. And these skills are rarely taught within academic programs. So if you're listening today that you don't work with humans, then this might still be interesting because we still live in a person and a human environment. But I'd really like you to think, as you're sitting there, maybe setting, an intention around choosing to do something that tests your comfort zones, tests that pushes you into doing something differently based on the things that I want, that I'm going to present for you today. Because I think that building narrative skills are foundational. They give us an access to language and to concepts that we might have seen and felt in the clinic, but often maybe don't have the words to help us make sense of. An analogy I often think is useful here would be imagining a football player, that is playing in a grand final and wants to win the grand final and to be able to, kick goals, which might be analogous to us working with people in persisting pain and having them change some of the way that they work within their world. That's kicking a big goal. But imagine if that football player had never learned how to dribble or to pass or to have a chance to practice. That might be how we are as we are aiming to step into this scope of psychologically informed care. So I think that the discipline of narrative medicine is a chance to practice those skills. So my aims in this presentation are simple. I want you to think critically about the role of communication skills in pain care, not to accept them blindly, but to apply some critical thinking, and to recognize that those skills are what we need to be able to communicate in the clinic, and to explore some ways for yourself to expand your capacity for hearing someone's story. And they're things that we'll talk about. So obviously our starting point here must be, what is narrative medicine? So narrative medicine is an emerging academic discipline that's rooted in the medical humanities, but applied in such a way that comes to the professional skill of communication and action in caring for humans. So it was pioneered at Columbia University by Professor Rita Sharon, and involves combining the skills of close reading and analysis of literature, poetry, and visual arts. And those are hallmark skills of the English department, but they're used within narrative medicine as a vehicle to build back the skills for empathic listening and authentic communication. So Rita Sharon describes it herself in this quote, talking about this need for narrative competence to acknowledge, absorb, interpret, and act on the stories and the plights of others. And this is an ancient quote, 2001, but I think we're still aiming for this humanization of healthcare, of care, in a really changing sociocultural world. So how does narrative medicine work? Well, we deliver a workshop. We use a group setting, and we would look at a carefully chosen text together, analyze it to see how the author or the artist might have helped us to see a story or to feel and experience, deconstructing that in the context of our experiences, our place in the world, considering the difference that others in the group might bring to the table, and using that discussion to form a light or a shadow in which we would then produce our own piece of writing around the themes that we've explored in that discussion. So in this process of building narrative competence through this sort of assessment and reflection technique, it's personal, it's unique, it's often cathartic and therapeutic, and so unlike the kind of the clinical face and the distance that sometimes becomes the default stance that we have in our daily practice of healthcare. So maybe that all sounds a bit academic, a bit obtuse, a bit oddly postmodern, and it's certainly something that's better experienced than explained. And I will give you a sneak peek further on in this talk how we might explore something. But as we do in all of our evidence-based therapies, we need to know and measure. How do we know what narrative medicine does? Because it's a bit of a slippery thing to define. There's a very nice study, and I've included all my references at the end of this this presentation. A very nice study that was a systematic review of content and outcomes of various academic programs for narrative medicine, based on the way that we have been taught at Columbia University using text analysis and reflective writing. So the analysis here was looking at, they were primarily mixed methods. So we had qualitative and quantitative techniques used to analyze these programs. But what the things that came up as being the most significant as outcomes were these three: of having done a narrative medicine program, that the participants found they had a greater capacity for relationship building, for empathic action, and perspective taking and reflection. So these are very useful human skills. If we move across to psychologically informed care then, and particularly for people in pain, I've pulled from this study by Diarmaid and his colleagues that looked at the observations of experienced physios in the application of psychologically informed practice. So people that were delivering this kind of care and experienced in doing so, and how they defined the aims of what they were trying to do. So they were aiming with delivering these different methodologies of building a therapeutic alliance, reducing perceived threat, reconceptualizing belief, thematic experience, and fostering self-efficacious behavior. So although this comes from the world of physical therapy or physiotherapy, I hope that when we're working in psychologically informed ways, so if we're using techniques like CBT, acceptance commitment therapy, motivational interviewing, or other methods, that across disciplines we're using fairly similar ways of doing that. And what I posit here is, if we look at the similarities between what narrative medicine does in their programs and the aims of what we want to develop in psychologically informed care, I think we can see there's a nice lineup in the way that building narrative competence might have the ability then to help a clinician expand their scope of practice and deliver this psychologically informed care, which I think is so important for really efficacious care for people in pain. So there's another lens I wanted to bring to this, to think about, what is happening here, in what capacity are we really building when we study literature and art and engage in this humanities in this way. And I think there's also that we're building new neural pathways for language and understanding of how language works, and awareness and capacity to explore the world of others, and that idea of otherness, to confront discomfort, conflict, challenging narratives, and to explore themes that have run through history and through society, and these human experiences that push us out of our comfort zone, both personally and professionally, whether it's something as simple as simply reading a poem aloud to a group. That might be the first push of a comfort zone, but it might also push you into considering things that live in the margins, perhaps, of our clinical practice, which might be sociology, ethics, narratology, social justice, philosophy. So the reference I've given here is actually to Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. It's a thick book. You probably don't need to read that whole book. But why I included this is, I think that, exposing ourselves to the humanities, we create some new, cognitive defaults and cognitive ease with which to encounter the stories that we get in the clinic. A bit like that soccer player analogy. We've set ourselves up to kick goals and to learn new frameworks and that are the methods of this psychologically informed practice. And I'd love to do some research that looks at narrative medicine as a tool for building cognitive flexibility in practitioners, which people that practice ACT will be very familiar with. And I'd love to look at how we might alter or enhance cognitive flexibility for practitioners to affect patient outcomes. That would be really interesting research, I think. But let's get a bit more into narrative and to story here. And I think stories are a bit fashionable. No, they never went out of fashion. Human history is told in the narrative. But here I wanted to give you just a bit more food for thought, and even perhaps, open up a bit of an awareness that we think we know stories because we tell stories, and just asking for someone's story in the clinic. We might be a bit under-resourced and under-prepared for the kinds of stories that come to us. Stories can be a bit of a Pandora's box. You can't put those things back in once they come up. So people often use narrative and story interchangeably, but they're not synonymous. And I think that's really important, is that, stories as defined, this is an excellent author, Anne Harrington. So she is a medical historian. But she defines stories in this as being living and local and specific. So a person's story is exactly what they say it is. It's the truth of their life, their experience of the world, and what is meaningful to them. A narrative is different. A narrative, it tells a bigger story. It's a story fits perhaps inside a narrative, but narratives are our social conditions, our bigger picture, our things that are influential on a story and how we hear a story, and this is context. And we know from our science side of things, particularly when we think about the emergence and the persistence of pain, is how critical context really is. So here, I think we have to consider that we are coming to learn, or to apply, or try to apply a lot more of a scientific, maybe neuroscience, embodied cognition perspective on and psychologically informed information about pain. But sometimes and often, I think if we look at social narratives on social media, that people living with persisting pain don't automatically take up those narratives quite as enthusiastically as we might hope that they do. And unfortunately, sometimes what happens, rather than really asking why, is that we apply judgment to those stories that people tell us, or to the way that we interact with them. When stories meet science, sometimes it's judgment that comes out. And these I think we're given permission as clinicians, unfortunately, by some of the power differentials that exist within the medical world, to apply these labels of difficult patient, of unreliable historian, or people that are non-compliant. And I think this is a great injustice that we do to people. We expect that people's story to fit into our narrative, and there's an injustice that we do very much by giving putting these judgments upon people. Because these judgments, and particularly within, say, compensable systems, when someone else is paying, we're the experts, but our inability perhaps to make stories and narratives work together is a great source of injustice. And it makes me think of a patient that I had very early in my career, when I knew almost nothing. You finish university and you know nothing. But I felt I was allowed to apply these labels and these judgments. I didn't know any better. And for this patient, I took his non-compliance to my fabulous exercise program personally. I think that we often do that. Why don't people do what I tell them to do? And somehow, by some stroke of luck, I developed enough rapport with him to eventually, for him to tell me that he was homeless, and that my silly exercises were not only hard for him to do in the car that he was sleeping in, but that were completely irrelevant to him, in the context of, a 6-foot-tall man sleeping in a hatchback, fearing for his job and his future. So we really have a lot of responsibilities with stories and the way that we interact with them. So with considering all of this stuff so far, wouldn't it be nice, to get a map? How do we make our way through this puzzle, this difficulty of interacting with people's stories, with the narratives that form around those stories, and that they're individual and they're unique, and that there are methods and ways that we can learn them. That takes experimentation and ambiguity and is difficult. And humans like certainty. We would like to be told the answer, and can I just get, the step-by-step of how to make all this work? And so I wanted to give you a starting point in these illness narrative typologies, to give us something to consider that might feel a bit safer than all of this uncertainty with stories. I hope that this book, The Wounded Storyteller by Arthur Frank, is not unfamiliar to you listening, and it's an accessible book, and it's something I think is an essential book. And in Frank's book here, and he's a sociologist and he's written many wonderful books, and I absolutely recommend you seek him out. But what he sets out here is a landscape of stories that might help us to situate the kinds of stories that we hear in the clinic. And I'm going to present this to you with a little bit of caution, to steer away from the perhaps the seductive idea that we can diagnose stories or fit them into some neat categorization. They're generalizations. But what I've included them here, and we'll talk about them, to bring a bit of comfort. Although this narrative work and learning and narrative medicine takes time and it's never done, different disciplines like sociology might give us some guides to make sense of things along the way. So there's 3 typologies within that book that Frank presents us. And I'm going to start with the first one here, which is the idea of a restitution narrative, a story that I was well. I'm not well now, but I can be fixed and things will be back to normal. This is a kind of mechanistic kind of a metaphor. And let's take a second and just sit and consider that we've probably heard these kinds of stories in the clinic. Those of you that use ACT might think about, where is this person? Where might they live relative to cognitive flexibility and to the hexaflex? And also thinking about the challenge and perhaps even the identity and sense of self-challenge that might come for someone that runs this dominant narrative of restitution, of being able to fix things and go back to normal. How difficult it might be for them to accept the symptoms of their life and to accept change, and how that changes their entire life. And that's one typology we can think about. We also have a chaos narrative. So these are stories that are almost unspeakable, like they're non-stories of just surviving through the here and the now, without a safe mooring point to reflect on the past and to consider the future. And these stories might be, most accurately told through missed appointments, confusion, tone of voice, body posture. You might consider these kinds of stories from viewing them in the negative. What are the things that are not being told in this person's life and this story? And chaos narratives are really confronting because of the way that many of the things that come up here are things that we as clinicians can have no influence on. We can't do anything about it. And I hate things I can't do something with. That's how we often are in our clinical persona and position. But in a chaos narrative, what's important here is that we can recognize, we can validate, we can open up all of those difficult things and those difficult experiences, so we can fairly and accurately represent that person without judgment, to be able to meet someone where they are and to carefully dose that psychologically informed care that might be very helpful, but recognizing where they're coming from and their ability to be able to use that in the moment. understanding that these kinds of stories exist help us to situate this person in the clinic. And then there's a third narrative. So this quest narrative, this is the great hero's journey and adventure. Now, we like these stories. These are the ones that we read in blog posts and success stories. And this is every Disney movie you've ever watched. These stories conform to plot structure. They make sense. They're comfortable. And often they're told after the fact. No, not from the midst of the chaos or the struggle with acceptance, but in retrospect, when the dots can be connected backwards. And perhaps part of our role in the clinic is to help people to reauthor their stories into this form. But don't be seduced into thinking that these stories are going to be told to you necessarily in the clinic. That's not this, they don't unfold in this lovely narrative structure. So these typologies of Frank kind of give us a place to explore. This is a map to start an adventure and to put also our own stories into the mix. How do we know how we're going to interact with these kinds of stories? I think this is where our narrative medicine practices give us a chance to try on some different ideas in a safe environment. So we're not going to do a workshop or the work here, but I'm going to give you a brief taste of how we might approach this kind of learning. So I'm going to use this lovely piece of abstract art from Piet Mondrian. So it's Trafalgar Square. And if we were using this in a workshop, I would ask you to sit with it closely and quietly. So you might take a screenshot even of this presentation, take a note, and you can do this yourself at home. As a teacher in a workshop, I'd ask you, where does this painting take you? Now that's open-ended, that's very rich in possibility. I mean, that could take you anywhere. And then I'd ask you, what in this painting takes you there? And bringing your awareness back to the material details, to the form in front of you, building that skill of paying attention. Is it the lines? Is it the shapes, the colors, the block arrangement, things relative to each other? Does it bring a memory? Like how do you get wherever you go with this image? We might, in teaching, discuss the way that Mondrian has removed curves and organic forms from this artwork. And earlier in his career, he painted landscapes and people, but how did he come to still want to express human experience and the human world without any curve or shape? What does that say about the world in which we live? So this might seem like fluffy postmodern navel gazing, and I've had plenty of criticism of the method for that. But this is one practice that's a practice in seeing, reflecting, relating, building your capacity to quickly see and notice how you respond to things, what influences your thinking. So in a workshop, after a group discussion, multiple points of view, then we would actually write for 5 minutes to a prompt. For this image, it might be something like, what do you see between the lines? And you would just write for 5 minutes, and whatever comes up, comes up. And then you'd share it if you wanted to with the group or with someone individually, and we could talk about it in the same way. How does this affect you? I'm hoping you can see here how this practice can build relationship, can build empathic connection in the way that it is delivered. But we could also use something completely different. This is MC Escher's relativity. We can explore it in the same way. But here we have human form to explore. We have a space that's familiar yet foreign in its perspective. We might have a feeling or notice confusion or distortion, or what's our own embodied sense, perhaps, of being in this image. If we have a group that might be literate in Frank's typologies. This might be a chaos narrative in the way that it goes up and down and around. And how does that make us feel? And how do we respond to that? So in this image and focusing around this image, perhaps what we can learn from this is lessons in perspective taking, differences in reality. You know, how might this expand psychological flexibility and your tolerance for discomfort? So the point of all of this, you know, looking at art, and I've only given you art as an example here. We can use poems, we can use literature. The point of all of this is to create conditions to bring, you know, humanity back into healthcare and into the clinical interactions by rebuilding these skills of interaction in creative and generous ways, and making that foundation that then we can put our psychologically informed methods on top in a way that keeps the person in pain at the center of their care. And I drew this quote from the review that I referenced earlier. And what I liked from this quote, as it defines the outcomes from the narrative medicine programs, was this ongoing exploration. It makes me think of the way we might use narrative medicine as a medium for knowledge sharing within teams, across disciplines, fostering interdisciplinary care, and taking away, in some part, maybe the silos and the separations of hierarchy that affect the clinician's human experience of their profession. So, what are we going to do with all of this stuff? There's lots of nice, juicy things to think about, lots of nice words, academic concepts, but what do we do with this in practicality? Particularly if you don't have a humanities faculty to work with, or a narrative medicine teacher. What are you going to do with this? So when I was completing my narrative medicine studies, there was one thing that really jumped out at me as I was doing the work. It was that I didn't have the cognitive and even like the logistical time and space to read a challenging academic paper or a difficult piece of literature, or to analyze a film, and to consider themes and what's going on in that film. This study really forced me to think about my education, my approach to professional development, and from a place of wholeness, of a whole person. And we talk about that with our patients and the people that come to us for care, but do we think about that for ourselves as clinicians? So what I wish for you to take from this talk is the permission to approach your professional learning and your, I call it professional self-care, with that lens of whole person fulfillment and of creative engagement. And I want to give you permission here to think of, a trip to the theatre or to the ballet. These embodied stories you see there, to visit a museum or an art gallery, or to read a poem or engage with some literature as valid and useful for you as healthcare professionals. To slow down and be present to the many possibilities you have to encounter stories and the world around you. I've included travel there, and I know at the moment we can't travel far, but slowing down and exploring the world around you with that sort of that slow, inquiring eyes of engaged curiosity builds your ability to take those same engaged and curious eyes and vision with you into the clinic. There's plenty of places to engage with people and courses online. It's horrible self-promotion for me to mention our Facebook group, but it's free. We'd love to have you there. There's a community of over 1,000 people that are interested in painful stories and how they fit into, how our narrative and stories fit together. So please feel free to join us there. We have courses at Narrative RX, but also veering towards more of the academic perspective is the Principles and Practice textbook, which is edited by Professor Sharon, but covers a great breadth of the practice, but also opens the scope into into ethics and to various other areas that I think are really so critical to the wholeness of ourselves in these clinical practices. It's not necessarily an easy read, but it's a rewarding read. And for those of you that are inclined to go towards something like the professional certification in narrative medicine, that's fully online. If you want to take the Columbia also has a master's program, which would entail you moving to New York. And I think for anyone that's really keen, Columbia are running a 2-day online workshop, I think next weekend. So pop along to narrativemedicine.org to see what's going on there. So to summarize it up, to finish up, really what I want you to think about is that clinical practice is creative. Now that doesn't take away any of the evidence base, any of the critical thinking, but this creative and expressive practices really are an important part of building the skill that keeps you engaged and with longevity in clinical practice. Now, if you work with humans, psychology is part of what you do. So whether you're doing a psychologically informed method or you simply are engaging with people where they're at, having an enhanced capacity to look at the wholeness of a person's experience, should be what we do normally. Shouldn't be doing something exceptional and special. And I think the more of us that are starting to do that, the more people are able to expect that as what they should get from care. And narrative medicine is one way for clinicians to build this capacity for hearing the whole story, getting all the news, as we might call it, and then to be able to layer on top of that the mindset, the cognitive skills that are these specific psychological interventions. So I'm sure we'll share both this video and the slides. Very happy for you to do so. My reading list is there. If you want to find me with having a unique first name, I'm very easy to find online, but you can start with Twitter or you can find me at info@narrativerx.com. Thank you so much.